Video game tutorials are a difficult art for developers to master. They're necessary to acquaint players with the game's specific mechanics and systems, but preventing them from coming off as dry or dull is no easy feat. In fact, there are only a handful of truly brilliant, memorable tutorials out there, but great tutorials are hard to come by and bad ones are unfortunately in overabundant supply. I'm Jess from WhatCulture, and here are the 10 worst video game tutorials everyone hated. Number 10. Final Fantasy XIII. Though it's entirely reasonable for massive RPGs to serve up sizable tutorials right out the gate, Final Fantasy XIII took this to hair-pulling extremes with an agonizingly comprehensive and drawn-out series of tutorial lasting more than 5 of its 40 to 50 hours. That's about 10% of the entire damn game. It's all well and good coming up with nuanced gameplay mechanics that require the player to pay attention and think about what they're doing, but it needs to be fun and delivered in a way that keeps the player both engaged and excited. Of Final Fantasy XIII's many failures, this was its worst. Making matters worse, however, was that even when you dispensed with the main tutorials, the game holds your hand along a corridor for another 20 or so hours, while occasionally fielding out more tutorials, before finally allowing you to explore the open world. This drip feeding of information was presumably intended to break up the tedium, yet ironically made a solid half of the game feel like a soulless chore. Sometimes less is more. Number 9. The Witcher 2: Assassins of Kings. Despite how meticulously crafted The Witcher 2 otherwise is, its original release boasted one of the most ham-handed and muddled tutorials of any modern AAA game. So bad, in fact, that CD Projekt Red had to update it when they released the enhanced edition barely a year later. The Witcher 2's tutorial throws the player into a surprisingly tough battle with little explanation for how the game's combat, crafting, targeting, or even basic menu navigation works, resulting in many players not only dying in the damn tutorial, but needing to find a freaking guide online just to get through it. Making matters worse, a random glitch caused many players to be locked out of certain abilities, making progress near impossible or extremely difficult. It's a tutorial so off-putting and annoying, many players simply decided to skip it entirely and try their luck with the game proper. Number 8. Gran Turismo. As brilliant as the Gran Turismo games might be, the majority of the entries into the series come with one major caveat. You need to complete various driving license tests in order to unlock more difficult races and progress through the career mode. These tests range from hilariously easy to infuriatingly difficult, with time limits becoming increasingly tight the further along you go, and more demanding maneuvers are asked of the player. While some petrol heads may take joy in nailing a perfectly executed circuit of a track, for more casual players, the license tests are as dry and unappealing as sandpaper, while gating off the part of the game they're actually interested in. An awful double whammy of time-consuming and repetitive, Gran Turismo's license tests may technically teach you something, but you'll probably end up wishing they hadn't. Number 7. The Legend of Zelda: Twilight Princess. The Legend of Zelda games have an unfortunate knack for forcing the player into patronizing, hand-holding tutorials. And that's arguably no truer than in 2006's otherwise brilliant Twilight Princess. The game begins with Link working as a ranch hand in Orden Village, which serves as a thinly veiled excuse for the game to introduce all of its core gameplay mechanics in a listless laundry list of busy work tasks. Whether fishing, herding goats, or even practicing your sword skills, it's all painfully sluggish and boring, and ends up taking around an hour to complete before the main game actually kicks off. Given that Ocarina of Time, the first 3D game, took a far less pandering approach to tutorials than this, it's pretty absurd that the game thought so little of players to force them through a totally unnecessary dull slog of an opening hour. Number 6. Driver. You know it wouldn't be a list about painful tutorials if we didn't include one of the most infamously punishing video game tutorials of all time, the opening driving test from the 1991 PS1 classic Driver. The tutorial takes place in a garage, with players given merely a minute to pull off 9 scarcely explained vehicular maneuvers. If you played this as a kid, what hope in hell did you have of knowing what a slalom or reverse 180 meant, let alone actually pulling them off, or me pronouncing pronouncing them apparently. It's a tutorial which wasn't only the toughest mission in the game until the final one, but was so damn infuriating many never even got past it, or not without the help of an older sibling or parent at least. Given that Driver came out shortly before a major uptick in worldwide internet adoption, which put video game walkthroughs at everyone's fingertips, its absurd lack of specificity regarding the tasks it asked players to do was unforgivable. Atrocious. Number 5. Mario and Luigi Dream Team. When it comes to hand-holding tutorials, nothing beats Mario and Luigi Dream Team. A game so aggressively patronizing with its relentless pop-up factoids, you'd be forgiven for turning the game off and never going back. Whenever the player is required to perform even the most basic maneuver they haven't yet executed, even late in the game, play will be interrupted with a tutorial to make sure you're able, sometimes even asking you to demonstrate this ability several times. There's even a freaking tutorial for jumping, for God's sake, and the game feels the need to explain the notion of HP to you, in case you're literally a baby. While it's commendable that Nintendo makes games accessible to all ages, isn't the joy of discovery that much more fun? Just let players figure things out for themselves unless they get stuck, no? The hand-holding is egregious enough that it barely feels like you're actually playing the game at some points, as opposed to just following a strict series of instructions until the credits roll, which is, super fun. Number 4. Assassin's Creed III. Assassin's Creed 3 has such a soul-drainingly boring tutorial, it actively lessens the quality of the entire game, because close to half of it is effectively one big long tutorial. It's a tutorial so pervasive and excessive, it makes you question the very nature of video game tutorials, and it becomes tough to figure out where said tutorial ends and the actual game begins. After beginning the game as Desmond for a brief tutorial, players are then forced into the shoes of Haytham Kenway for the next 2-ish hours, where Desmond's traversal tutorial is more or less repeated alongside a series of snoozily basic tutorial set pieces. For some reason, it's a solid hour into the game before you do any significant combat maneuvers. Clearly, the intent here was to make the game's tutorial story-driven, but it was a gossamer thin attempt which only prolonged teaching mechanics that were incredibly simple to grasp in the first place. And even when you finally gain control of protagonist Raten Hakaten, you're initially forced to play him as a child for a tutorialized game of hide and seek, and after several more tutorials for tree climbing and hunting, you're again forced to prove you can carry out the traversal you already learned in the prior 2 tutorial sections. By the time you're finally kitted out in Assassin's garb, a solid 5 hours have passed, placing you close to the game's midway point. Considering that this is the 3rd entry into a hit annualized AAA franchise, anything beyond a cursory skippable tutorial sequence would have been overkill, and so treating players like idiots across 5 mostly tedious hours was inexcusable. Number 3. Far Cry 3 Blood Dragon. Far Cry 3 Blood Dragon is a thoroughly self-aware parody of 1980s action movies and video games, to the extent that it even mocks the very notion of a tutorial, by forcing players to sit through a boring as hell one. The opening sequence makes players press button prompts to demonstrate their ability to read, before receiving excessive pop-up tutorials for things as basic as looking around, jumping, and crouching, all while the player character complains about it and the AI companion asks, "Are these tutorials getting in the way of your mayhem?" The tutorial ends with a barrage of 11 pop-up screens in a row explaining more obvious gameplay, while cracking jokes and finally inviting the player to, quote, "make these patronizing screens go away" with a button press. This is proof that cutesy irony alone cannot save a tutorial from being infuriatingly boring. It's done with a wink, sure, but serving up an intentionally awful tutorial isn't much fun if it's genuinely dull, and the joke doesn't last that long. It may only be 5 minutes long, but it feels a lot longer. Number 2. Final Fantasy VIII. By far the most divisive aspect of Final Fantasy VIII is its esoteric magic junctioning system, in large part due to the fact that it's hardly explained at the start of the game, with a barrage of tutorials that aren't exactly the most user-friendly to get grips with. Millions of young kids playing Final Fantasy VIII were left struggling to figure out the junction mechanic, which massively overestimates the player's ability to soak in information when you're taking it from a series of overwhelmingly dense and dry tutorials. Given that junctioning is a vital facet of its gameplay, failing to understand it will make things majorly difficult, and it's absolutely the game's failing that so many took so long to get to grips with it. Final Fantasy VIII may have funneled you through a 25-hour corridor, but at least you knew what the hell you were doing. And no matter Final Fantasy VIII's divisive plot, there's nothing more irritating than its unacceptably scant tutorial for such a complex vocal gameplay system. Number 1. Jet Set Radio. Cult classic skating game Jet Set Radio may be gorgeous and fiendishly addictive, but it also features one of the most infuriatingly over-difficult tutorials in the history of gaming. The first few lessons start off easy enough, teaching basic movement and spray tagging, until the final test of the tutorial challenges the player to perform 50 tricks in a row without touching the ground or breaking the combo. The tutorial previously asked players to pull off 20 and 30 tricks in a row. But 50? Between the relatively floaty controls and limited environment you're given to pull off the combo, this one took hours for most unseasoned players to finish. What was supposed to be a light introduction to the game's mechanics ended up feeling like a legit late game challenge sequence. As a result, only 4.3% of Steam players have actually even completed the damn tutorial. Jesus. That's the end of our list, but let me know down in that comment section what your pick is for the worst video game tutorial you've ever come across. As always, I've been Jess from WhatCulture. Thank you so much for hanging out with me. If you like, you can come say hi to me on my Twitter account where I'm @JessMcDonnell, but make sure you stay tuned to us here for plenty more gaming goodness.